I didn't realize my own mother had blocked my home purchase until the bank officer quietly asked me a question that made my stomach drop. Did you authorize someone to call us about your mortgage application? At first, I thought it was just a misunderstanding, but then he said her name, and suddenly everything started making sense. I'm 32 years old, and until recently, I believed my relationship with my mother was complicated, but loving. The kind of complicated that happens in a lot of families. She had always been involved in my life, maybe a little too involved. But I never imagined that family interference could reach the point where it would literally stop me from buying my first home. Growing up, my mom liked to say she was protecting me from bad decisions, protecting me from the wrong people, protecting me from mistakes. At least, that's what she called it. When I was younger, it seemed normal. She questioned every friend I had. She didn't like most of the people I dated. When I got my first job after college, she insisted on reviewing my budget with me every month. Back then, I thought she just cared. Looking back now, I see something very different. But at the time, I was focused on one thing: independence. I had spent almost 10 years working my way up in a mid-sized marketing company. Nothing glamorous, but stable. Steady promotions, decent salary, careful saving. I lived in a small apartment for years, keeping my expenses low. I skipped vacations. I drove the same old car long after most people would have replaced it, all because I had one goal: buying my own house. Not a mansion, not some luxury dream, just a small place with a backyard and a quiet street. A place that was mine. No landlords, no roommates, no one telling me what I could or couldn't do. By the time I turned 32, I had saved nearly $80,000 for a down payment. Every dollar felt like a victory. Every dollar meant freedom was getting closer. My mom knew about my plan. Of course she did. She knew almost everything about my life. At first, she seemed supportive, or at least that's what I thought. She'd ask questions like, "Are you sure you're ready for that responsibility? Maybe you should wait a little longer. Interest rates are unpredictable right now." It sounded like concern, normal parental advice, but sometimes her tone made me feel small, like she didn't quite believe I could handle it. Still, I ignored that feeling, because the truth was I had never been more confident in my life. I had my finances in order, my credit score was excellent, my mortgage pre-approval came through faster than expected, and after months of searching, I finally found it. A modest two-bedroom house on a quiet street. White siding, old oak tree in the front yard, sunlight pouring through the kitchen windows. The moment I walked in, I felt something settle inside my chest. This is it. This is home. I made an offer 2 days later, and to my shock, it was accepted. I remember sitting in my car outside the real estate office, gripping the steering wheel and laughing out loud. I called my best friend first, then my coworker, then my mom. At first, she sounded excited, but there was a pause, a small one, just long enough for me to notice. "Well," she finally said, "I hope you know what you're doing." I laughed it off, because in that moment, nothing could ruin my happiness. I thought the hardest part was over: the paperwork, the inspections, the waiting. But I had no idea that behind the scenes, someone had already started quietly blocking my home purchase. And the worst part? It wasn't a stranger. It wasn't the bank. It wasn't the seller. It was my own mother. And I wouldn't find out about the family interference until it was almost too late. At first, it just felt like normal delays in a complicated finance story. A missing document here, an extra verification there. Nothing unusual. At least, that's what everyone kept telling me. But then, the calls from the bank started sounding different, more cautious, more confused. And one afternoon, a loan officer said something that made my heart sink. "Your mother has contacted us multiple times regarding your loan." That was the moment my entire finance story started to unravel, because the next thing he said was even worse. She expressed concerns about your financial stability and asked whether the bank had verified certain information. I remember gripping my phone so tightly my fingers hurt. My own mother questioning my finances? To the bank? About the house I had worked nearly a decade to afford. And suddenly I realized something terrifying. This wasn't just concern, this was deliberate family interference. And if I didn't figure out exactly what she had done, my dream house might disappear before I ever got the keys. And that was the moment I started asking a question I had never asked before. Was my mother trying to protect me, or was she trying to control me? At first, I told myself there had to be a simple explanation. My mom had always been protective. Maybe she was just asking questions. Maybe the bank officer misunderstood something. That's what I kept repeating in my head that evening. But the uneasy feeling in my stomach refused to go away. Because the truth was, my mother had never contacted my bank before, not once. And now, suddenly, during the most important finance story of my life, she was calling them multiple times. I decided to ask her about it, carefully, casually. The next evening, I stopped by her house for dinner like I usually did once a week. Nothing about the night seemed unusual. The same familiar smell of garlic and onions cooking in her kitchen, the same old radio playing softly in the background. She smiled when I walked in, but something about the smile felt tight, forced. "So," she said, setting a plate on the table, "how's the house situation going?" I hesitated for a second. Then I said it. "The bank mentioned you called them." Her reaction came a little too fast. "Oh, that." She waved her hand dismissively. "I was just making sure everything was legitimate." My chest tightened. "Making sure?" I asked. "Well, you know how these things are. People take advantage of young buyers." Young buyers. I was 32. I had spent nearly a decade building the savings for that house. Yet the way she said it made me feel like a naive teenager. I tried to stay calm. "But why would you call my bank?" I asked. She shrugged. "I just had a few questions." "What kind of questions?" Her eyes flicked away for a moment. Then she said something that made my stomach twist. "I told them I was worried you might be overextending yourself financially." I stared at her. "You told them that?" "I'm your mother," she replied calmly. "It's my job to look out for you." The conversation ended there, at least on the surface. But as I drove home that night, my mind kept replaying the bank officer's words. She contacted us multiple times. Multiple. Not once, not casually, multiple times. And suddenly, the delays in my mortgage process started feeling different. 3 days earlier, the bank had asked for additional employment verification. Then they wanted more documentation about my savings. Then another credit check. At the time, I assumed it was just standard procedure, but now I wasn't so sure. The next morning, my phone rang while I was at work. It was the loan officer again. His voice sounded careful, professional, but there was something underneath it, concern. "I wanted to update you on the situation." My heart started beating faster. "Is something wrong?" There was a pause. "Your application is still under review," he said slowly. My throat went dry. "Concerns from who?" Another pause. "You mentioned your mother." My hands went cold. What exactly did she say? He hesitated, clearly choosing his words carefully. "She suggested your financial stability might not be as strong as it appears on paper." I felt like the air had been sucked out of the room. "That's not true," I said quickly. "I understand," he replied, "but when a close family member raises concerns, our underwriting team has to review the file more closely." There it was, the words I had been afraid of. My mother hadn't just asked questions. Her family interference had actually triggered a deeper review of my loan, which meant my approval, the approval I thought was secure, was now hanging by a thread. And suddenly, my dream house felt fragile, unstable, like it could disappear at any moment. I hung up the phone and just sat there at my desk, staring at the wall. My own mother had inserted herself in my finance story in a way that could destroy everything I had worked for. But the worst part? I still didn't understand why. Why would she try to block my home purchase? Why would she tell the bank I wasn't financially stable? I had never missed a payment in my life. My credit score was excellent. My income was steady. None of it made sense. Unless This wasn't about money at all, unless this was something deeper, something darker. And for the first time, a terrible thought crossed my mind. Maybe my mother didn't want me to buy that house. Maybe she didn't want me to leave. And if that was true, then the family interference might be only the beginning of this entire finance story. Because what I didn't know yet was that my mother had already taken another step behind my back, a step that could completely block my home purchase. And I was about to find out the hard way. At first, I told myself there had to be a simple explanation. My mom had always been protective. Maybe she was just asking questions. Maybe the bank officer misunderstood something. That's what I kept repeating in my head that evening. But the uneasy feeling in my stomach refused to go away. Because the truth was, my mother had never contacted my bank before. For the next few days, I tried to focus on work. Emails, meetings, deadlines, normal life. But my mind kept drifting back to the same question. Why would my mother try to block my home purchase? The more I thought about it, the less her explanation made sense. If she was simply worried about my finances, she would have talked to me first. She always had before. Instead, she went straight to the bank. And not just once, multiple times. That didn't feel like concern. That felt like family interference. And the longer I sat with that realization, the more memories started resurfacing. Little things, small moments I had ignored for years. Moments that suddenly felt different. Like the time she insisted on co-signing my first car loan, even though my credit was already good enough. Or the time she asked for access to my budgeting app, just to help. Or the way she always reacted when I talked about moving to another city. There was always hesitation, always some reason why it might not be a good idea. At the time, I told myself she was just being a cautious parent. But now it felt like a pattern of control. And this house represented something bigger than real estate. It represented independence, the kind that didn't require her approval, the kind that didn't revolve around her opinions, the kind that meant I might not need her anymore. That thought made my chest tighten, because if that was the real reason, then my finance story wasn't just about buying a house. It was about breaking free from a relationship that had quietly shaped my entire adult life. Still, I needed facts, not assumptions. So the next morning, I called the bank again. This time, I asked to speak directly with my loan officer. When he answered, his voice sounded polite, but slightly cautious. I had a couple questions, I said carefully. Of course. I took a breath. Exactly how many times has my mother contacted the bank? There was a pause. Then he said something that made my stomach drop. 3 times. 3. Not one. Not a quick call out of concern. 3 separate conversations. My fingers tightened around the phone. And what exactly did she say? Another pause. Then he answered carefully. She expressed concern that you might not fully understand the long-term financial responsibility of homeownership. I closed my eyes. 32 years old, 10 years of saving, a spotless credit history. And somehow she had convinced the bank that I didn't understand basic finances. But he wasn't finished. There was also another claim. My heart started pounding. What claim? That you might be planning to leave your current job. I sat upright in my chair. What? That's what she told us. I felt a wave of disbelief crash over me. That's not true, I said immediately. I know, he replied calmly. But when statements like that are made, underwriting has to verify them. Which explained the sudden employment verification request, the extra paperwork, the delays. My mother hadn't just interfered, she had planted doubt. Doubt that was now threatening to completely block my home purchase. I thanked him for the information and ended the call. Then I sat there in silence, trying to process what I had just learned. This wasn't accidental. This wasn't a misunderstanding. This was deliberate family interference in the most important finance story of my entire life. And suddenly, another memory surfaced. 2 weeks earlier during Sunday lunch, my mom had said something strange. You know, she told me casually, houses can trap people. I laughed. What do you mean?
They tie you down, she said. Once you buy one, you can't leave. At the time, I thought she meant financially, but now I wondered if she meant something else entirely. Because if she truly believed that, then my independence might feel like abandonment to her. And if that was the case, then she might be willing to do whatever it took to stop it, including trying to block my home purchase completely. But the most disturbing realization hadn't even hit me yet, because later that afternoon, my real estate agent called, and the first sentence out of her mouth made my heart stop. "Did you tell someone to contact the seller about canceling the deal?" My blood ran cold. "No," I said slowly. "Why?" She hesitated. "They didn't give a full name," she said, "but they claimed they were your mother." For a moment, I couldn't speak. The office around me felt strangely quiet, like the air had thickened. "What exactly did they say?" I asked finally. Another pause. "She expressed concern that you might not fully understand the long-term financial responsibility of homeownership." My chest tightened. She said what? My agent sighed softly. "I didn't believe it," she said quickly, "but you need to understand how sensitive sellers can be during escrow." And she was right. In a competitive housing market, uncertainty could kill a deal instantly. If the seller believed my financing was unstable, they might walk away or accept another offer, which meant months of searching, months of saving could disappear overnight, all because of family interference I never asked for. "This is my purchase," I said firmly. "She has nothing to do with it." "I understand," my agent replied, "but the seller's side wanted reassurance." That's when the reality of my situation finally hit me. My own mother wasn't just questioning my decision privately, she was actively trying to block my home purchase from multiple directions: the bank, the seller, anyone involved in the transaction. My entire finance story had suddenly become unstable, and I was the last person to realize it. That evening, I drove straight to my mother's house. I didn't call ahead, I didn't text, I just showed up. The porch light was on, like always. She opened the door with the same calm smile she always wore, but the moment she saw my face, the smile faded slightly. "What's wrong?" she asked. I walked inside slowly. "We need to talk." She frowned. "About what?" "You called the seller." Her eyes flickered. Just for a second. Then she looked away. "I was just trying to help," she said quietly. "Help?" I repeated. My voice sounded sharper than I expected. "You told them my financing might fail." "I didn't say it would fail," she replied defensively. "I just said there were concerns." I stared at her. "You created those concerns." Her jaw tightened. "You're overreacting." That sentence hit harder than anything else she'd said, because suddenly I realized something painful. She didn't see what she was doing as wrong, not at all. In her mind, this was justified, necessary. "I've worked 10 years to afford this house," I said slowly. "I know," she replied. "Then why are you trying to block my home purchase?" She crossed her arms. "I'm trying to protect you." The same phrase she had used my entire life. Protect you. But now it sounded different, colder, more controlling. "From what?" I asked. She looked at me for a long moment. Then she said something that made my chest ache. "You think buying a house means I'm leaving you. You already barely visit," she said. "If you move farther away, I'll never see you." Her voice wasn't angry, it was scared. But fear didn't change what she'd done. "You don't get to sabotage my life because you're afraid," I said quietly. Her expression hardened. "You're being dramatic." That word again. Dramatic. Like my reaction was the problem, not her actions. That's the moment something inside me shifted. For years, I had accepted small boundaries being crossed, small decisions being questioned, small pieces of control disguised as love. But this wasn't small anymore. This was my future, and her family interference had nearly destroyed the biggest step forward in my entire finance story. "Don't contact the bank again," I said. "Don't contact the seller." She didn't answer. She just looked at me with an expression I couldn't quite read. Part disappointment, part resentment, and something else, something stubborn. That's the moment I realized something terrifying. She didn't think this conversation was over, and if she kept interfering, she might actually succeed in completely blocking my home purchase. Because the next morning, the bank called again, and this time the news was worse than anything I had expected. My loan approval was being temporarily suspended until further investigation, and suddenly my entire finance story was on the verge of collapsing. When the bank told me my loan approval was being temporarily suspended, I felt like the floor had disappeared beneath me. Suspended? I repeated slowly. The loan officer's voice was calm but careful. Yes, our underwriting team needs to review some concerns that were raised. Concerns, that word again. My chest tightened. Concerns raised by my mother? I asked. There was a small pause on the other end of the line. Yes, he admitted. I closed my eyes. For a moment, I couldn't speak. 10 years of saving, months of searching, weeks of paperwork, and now my entire finance story was hanging by a thread because of someone else's claims. Can you tell me exactly what she said? I asked quietly. The loan officer hesitated. I'm limited in what I can disclose, he said, but she suggested that you may not have been fully transparent about your financial obligations. My heart skipped. What obligations? She implied that you might be supporting family members financially and that those expenses weren't reflected in your loan application. I felt a wave of disbelief rush through me. That's not true, I said immediately. I understand, he replied, but when a close family member raises those concerns, our compliance team has to verify everything. Verification meant delays. Delays meant risk, and risk meant the seller could walk away, which meant my dream house could vanish because of family interference that I never approved. I can provide any documentation you need, I said quickly. I believe you, he replied. But these reviews take time. Time, the only thing I didn't have. My closing date was only 3 weeks away. If the bank didn't resolve the investigation before then, the deal could collapse completely. And suddenly, the terrifying reality settled in. My mother might actually succeed in blocking my home purchase. That evening, I sat alone in my apartment, the place that was supposed to be temporary, the place I had been planning to leave behind. Boxes were already stacked near the walls. Packing supplies, moving checklists, little reminders of the life I thought was about to begin. Now they just looked like evidence of a dream falling apart. My phone buzzed. It was a text from my mother. "Are you still upset with me?" I stared at the message for a long time. Then another text appeared. "I'm only trying to help." Help. That word made my chest tighten, because the truth was, her version of help was slowly destroying my entire finance story. I didn't reply. Not that night, not the next day either. For the first time in my life, I stopped explaining myself to her, stopped defending my decisions, stopped trying to convince her that I was capable of running my own life. Instead, I focused on the one thing that mattered now, saving the deal. Over the next week, I sent the bank every document they asked for: employment verification, savings statements, tax records, even written confirmation from my HR department that I had no plans to leave my job. Piece by piece, I rebuilt the credibility that family interference had damaged. But emotionally, something inside me was cracking. Not just anger, something deeper, a painful realization. Because this wasn't the first time my mother had crossed a line, it was just the first time the consequences were this big. And the more I thought about it, the clearer something became. If I somehow managed to save this deal, then things between us would never be the same. Because love wasn't supposed to feel like control, support wasn't supposed to sabotage your future, And a parent definitely wasn't supposed to try blocking their child's home purchase behind their back. But the real breaking point came 3 days later, when my real estate agent called again. Her voice sounded tense. "I need to tell you something," she said. My heart started pounding. "What is it?" She hesitated. "Your mother contacted the seller again." I felt the air leave my lungs. "She did what?" "She told them your financing investigation means the deal probably won't close." For a moment, I couldn't breathe. This wasn't just family interference anymore. This was full sabotage. And in that moment, something inside me changed completely. Because if my own mother was willing to destroy my biggest life milestone, then I was finally going to stop playing defense and start protecting my future. Silently, carefully, strategically. Because what she didn't realize yet was that her attempt at blocking my home purchase had just pushed me into a new phase of this entire finance story. And from this point forward, I was done playing the only one fair. The moment I realized my mother had contacted the seller again, something inside me shifted. Not anger, not panic, something quieter, colder. For the first time since this whole finance story began, I stopped reacting emotionally and started thinking strategically. Because the truth was, yelling at her hadn't changed anything. Explaining hadn't changed anything. Even confronting her directly hadn't stopped the family interference. If anything, it seemed to encourage it. So I decided to do something different. I stopped telling her anything. The first step was simple: information control. Up until that point, my mom had known almost every detail of my home buying process: closing dates, loan updates, inspection results. She knew because I had told her, because I believed families shared things like that. But now I understood something important. Information had become a weapon, and she was using it to block my home purchase. So I took that weapon away. I stopped discussing the house entirely. When she texted asking how the process was going, I gave vague answers. Still working on paperwork. Nothing new yet. Just waiting on the bank. Technically true, but no details. No timelines. No opportunities for more family interference. The second step required a much harder conversation. I scheduled a meeting with my loan officer, in person. When I sat down in his office, I explained everything, calmly, carefully. "My mother doesn't have access to my financial information," I said. "She's been contacting you without my permission." He nodded slowly. "Yes, we understand that now. But I want to make something very clear," I continued. "She is not involved in this transaction in any way." His expression softened. "That's already been noted in your file." "Good," I said, "because this finance story is mine, not hers." Then I asked the question that had been sitting in my mind all week. "Is there anything else she told you?" He hesitated. Then he sighed slightly. "She implied that you might ask her for financial help after buying the house." I almost laughed. Not because it was funny, because it was absurd. "I have never asked her for money," I said, "and I never will." He nodded. "We've already confirmed that." And with that, the final piece of doubt the bank had about my situation slowly began to disappear. My documentation was solid, my employment was stable, my savings were real. Despite all the attempts at family interference, the numbers told the truth, and numbers are very hard to argue with. But the most important move came next. I called my real estate agent. "We need to control communication with the seller," I told her. She sounded relieved. "I was hoping you'd say that." From that moment forward, the seller's agent was instructed to ignore any outside contact. Only 2 voices mattered, mine and my agent's. Anyone else claiming to represent me would be dismissed immediately, which meant my mother had just lost her ability to manipulate the deal from the outside. For the first time since this nightmare started, her attempts at blocking my home purchase were losing power. But the real turning point came 3 days later, when the bank called again, and this time the tone was completely different. "Your file review is complete," the loan officer said. I held my breath. "And?" There was a small pause. Then he said the words I had been waiting to hear for weeks. "Your loan approval has been fully reinstated." For a moment, I couldn't speak. Months of stress, weeks of sabotage, and somehow my finance story had survived despite all attempts at family interference. The deal was moving forward again. But something else had changed too, because now I understood something I hadn't before. My mother had tried everything she could to block my home purchase, and when that failed, she was going to face the one thing she never expected: consequences. Not loud ones, not dramatic ones, quiet ones, the kind that arrive slowly and last a lifetime. Because the final chapter of this finance story hadn't happened yet. Closing day was still coming, and so was the moment my mother would realize something important. She hadn't stopped me. She had only changed how I would move forward without her.
Closing day arrived on a quiet Tuesday morning. The kind of morning that feels strangely ordinary, even when your entire life is about to change. I barely slept the night before, not because I was worried the deal would fall apart again, but because I kept thinking about everything that had happened to get there. The weeks of stress, the investigations, the attempts at family interference that nearly destroyed my entire finance story. And yet somehow, I had made it to the finish line. At 10 a.m., I sat in the title company's office with a thick stack of documents in front of me, page after page, signature after signature, each one bringing me closer to the moment that my mother had tried so hard to stop, the moment that would prove she hadn't succeeded in blocking my home purchase. My real estate agent sat across from me smiling. "You're almost a homeowner," she said. The words felt surreal, because for weeks it had seemed impossible. Every time things moved forward, another piece of family interference appeared to push the deal backward. But not today. Today, the numbers were final. The loan was approved. The paperwork was complete. And after the last signature, the title officer slid one final document toward me. "Congratulations," she said. "You're officially the owner." For a moment, I just stared at the paper. My name, the property address, proof that the entire finance story had ended the way it was supposed to. I owned my home, despite everything. The first person I called wasn't my mother, it was my best friend. She screamed so loudly into the phone that I had to hold it away from my ear. "You did it," she shouted. "I knew you would." After that, I called a few close friends, people who had supported me through the whole process, people who had never once tried to sabotage my decisions. But I didn't call my mom, not right away. For the first time in my life, she wasn't the first person to know about a major milestone, and strangely, that felt peaceful. 3 days later, she found out anyway, not from me, from my aunt. Apparently, my aunt had seen the public property record update online, which meant the news traveled quickly through the family. That evening, my phone rang. Mom. I stared at the screen for a long moment before answering. Her voice sounded different than usual, less confident. "I heard you bought the house." I kept my tone calm. "Yes." A long silence followed. "You didn't tell me," she said. "You tried blocking my home purchase," I replied quietly. Another silence, this one heavier. "I was trying to help," she said again, the same sentence she had repeated throughout this entire finance story. But now it sounded weaker, because the outcome had already happened. Her family interference hadn't worked. I didn't need help. I needed support. She didn't respond. Instead, she asked a different question. "Where is the house?" I paused, and then I said something she had probably never expected to hear.
I'm not ready to share that. The silence that followed felt enormous, because for the first time in my life, I had set a boundary she couldn't cross. No address, no spare key, no involvement in my decisions. She had tried to control my future, and now she no longer had access to it. A week later, I stood in the backyard of my new home. The oak tree cast long shadows across the grass. The air smelled like fresh paint and cut wood from the small renovations I had started. And for the first time since this entire finance story began, I felt something I hadn't felt in a long time: peace. Because despite every attempt at family interference, despite every effort to block my home purchase, I was finally living in a place that belonged entirely to me. But the most surprising part of the story wasn't the house, it was the realization that came with it. My mother hadn't lost control because I fought her. She lost control because I stopped letting her have it. And sometimes, that's the quietest form of karma there is. The first night I slept in the house felt strange. Not bad, just unfamiliar. The rooms were quiet in a way my apartment never was. No footsteps from neighbors upstairs, no traffic humming outside my window, just the soft creak of an old house settling into the night. I lay there staring at the ceiling for a long time, thinking about everything that had happened. Because when people hear stories like this, they often expect the ending to feel explosive, like some dramatic victory. But the truth is, the ending felt much quieter than that. This entire finance story had never really been about the house, not completely. The house was just the moment when something hidden in my life finally became visible. The moment when years of subtle family interference crossed a line that couldn't be ignored anymore. For most of my life, my mother framed her control as love, protection, guidance. And for a long time, I believed it. Because when someone raises you, you naturally assume they know what's best. You assume their opinions are wisdom. You assume their worries are justified. But adulthood slowly teaches you something different. Sometimes people don't try to control you because they think you're incapable. Sometimes they do it because they're afraid. Afraid of being alone. Afraid of losing relevance in your life. Afraid of change. In my mother's case, I think the house symbolized something she couldn't accept: independence, distance, a future where my life didn't revolve around her decisions anymore. And when she realized that future was coming, she tried to stop it, tried blocking my home purchase in ways I never thought possible. Not because she hated me, but because she couldn't imagine her world changing. That realization didn't excuse the damage her family interference caused, but it helped me understand it. And understanding something doesn't always mean fixing it. Sometimes it just means learning how to move forward. Over the next few weeks, I slowly settled into the house. New furniture, fresh paint, small improvements every weekend. Each change made the place feel more like home. And with every passing day, I felt something else growing too. Confidence. Not the loud kind, the quiet kind. The kind that comes from surviving something that almost broke your plans. My finance story started with a simple goal: buy a house. But it ended with something much bigger: boundaries. For the first time in my life, I understood that protecting your future sometimes means protecting it from people you love. Even family, especially family. My relationship with my mom didn't disappear. We still talk occasionally, short conversations, careful ones. But the dynamic has changed. She no longer knows every detail of my life. She no longer has a say in my decisions. And most importantly, she no longer has the power to influence the direction of my future. The house stands as a quiet reminder of that. A place built not just with savings and paperwork, but with independence. Sometimes I sit on the back porch in the evening watching the sunlight fade behind the oak tree in the yard, and I think about how close I came to losing this place, how close her family interference came to succeeding, how close she came to completely blocking my home purchase. But in the end, the story didn't belong to her. It belonged to me. And now I'm curious about something. If someone in your own family tried to interfere with one of the biggest decisions of your life, would you keep the peace or would you protect your future the way I finally did?